Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History of the Brooklyn Public Library. It's wonderful to see you on this cold, cold night, and we so appreciate your coming out. My name is Marcia Eli. I get to say some words of greeting on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library and all of my colleagues at the Center for Brooklyn History and all my colleagues at the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. Tonight's program is part of a series titled Just Conversation, presented in partnership with Brooklyn.org, which brings into dialogue issues facing our borough, city, and society to give voice to the change makers who move us towards a more equitable future. If anything describes tonight's panelists, that's it. In September, almost 200 years after slavery officially ended in New York, 4 New York City elected officials, Public Advocate Jumaane Williams, Council Member Crystal Hudson, Council Member Farrah Lewis, and Council Member Natasha Williams, introduced a package of groundbreaking bills acknowledging and addressing New York City's history of slavery. Most people have no clue that by the 1700s, New York City had one of the highest rates of slave ownership in the country. There is a lot of education to be done along with the repair work. Tonight we're going to hear details about this legislation and, more importantly, what it will mean in real terms to New York City's African American community and to all of us. Next week, the Center for Brooklyn History opens an important new exhibition which could not be more closely related to this conversation. Titled Traces, it examines the history of slavery in Brooklyn on the level of individual people and descendants, connecting real Brooklynites who were enslavers to descendants of those who they enslaved. I urge you all to come back and take it in. I want to mention that tonight is the first of 2 Just Conversations that focus on New York's effort to reckon with this history. The second, which takes place next month, brings together those who are working on the state level, including State Senator James Sanders and 2 of the commissioners appointed by Governor Hochul to the New York State Community Commission on Reparations Remedies, Lurie Daniel Favors and Derek Hamilton. I want to thank a few people. First of all, I want to thank Brooklyn Public Library's President Linda Johnson for being here tonight. We're really always so excited to welcome her to the Center for Brooklyn History to one of our programs. I want to thank our internal partner at the Brooklyn Public Library, BPL's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, for your collaboration, and give special thanks to the BPL colleagues in government and community relations for all you've done to make tonight's conversation happen. Following the moderated conversation, the panel will take your questions. We've offered you index cards and pencils as you came in, and if you haven't gotten one and you want one, our ushers will give you one, and they'll come up and down the aisles and collect those questions, and then we'll take as many as we have time for towards the end. Finally, we're lucky that tonight's moderator is another champion of this work, Linda Tagani, Chair and Executive Director of the New York City Commission on Racial Equity. So, Linda, Public Advocate Williams, Councilmember Hudson, Councilmember Lewis, Councilmember Williams, it's such an honor. Please help me welcome them to the stage.
Great. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. We have obviously a very important conversation to have, both one for this political moment that we're in, where we are committed to ensuring that our people remain safe and whole and are able to push forward and thrive in our city, but also around our nation. Before we get started, I wanted to offer a quote from Audre Lorde. We're going to learn a lot tonight about these bills, what our elected officials envision for New York City, the bravery and the courage that it took to get us here. And I wanted to uplift, Audre Lorde shared that our feelings are our most genuine paths to knowledge. And so as you hear what we talk about tonight, please be mindful of what is happening for you, what is coming up for you. That will help lead you to how you choose to be active and join the work to advance reparations and racial healing in New York City. As Marcia mentioned, my name is Linda Tajani. I go by she, her, they, them, or my name Linda. And I have the honor of both moderating tonight's panel, but also getting to work with our elected officials to advance this work through the Commission on Racial Equity. Just a quick note on the commission, we are people-led and informed. We were established in November of 2022 through a public initiative, through a public ballot. So overwhelmingly, New Yorkers across all 5 boroughs said racial equity is important to us, and we want to make sure it's important in government. So the Commission on Racial Equity is here to hold New York City government accountable to advancing racial equity in our operations, how we do our work, and increase community voice in government decision-making. So really making sure that communities are not only sharing what they think and what they would like to see, but informing and really shifting power in these conversations to make sure that the decisions reflect what we as New York City need in order to thrive. I wanted to take a moment to just provide a snapshot of the history in Brooklyn. So enslaved Africans were first brought by Dutch colonizers in the 1600s and 1700s, and by 1771, 33% of what is considered modern-day Brooklyn was made up of enslaved Africans. I'm sure that it comes as no surprise that Brooklyn is also home to a lot of known and unknown abolitionists and their allies. People who understood that enslaved Africans had the right to be free, the right to be self-determinating, the right to self-defense, and the right to be respected as human beings. Some of the history can be found here at the center, and I want to thank them for, one, creating these conversations, putting this together, and really truly participating in the spirit of the work, which is to make sure that people know, are informed, and can participate in reparations and racial healing. Some of the history in Brooklyn can also be found at the Weeksville Heritage Center or at 227 Duffield Street, which is the last remaining original structure on a block that's codenamed Abolitionist Place. So today's efforts towards freedom and self-determination and self-defense in the Black community looks like Know Your Rights trainings and Cop Watch trainings to end the killing of Black people by the NYPD, parent-peer support groups and relationships to end the separation of Black children from their families, and the emergence of Black-led worker cooperatives to advance economic stability. These are just a few of the examples that we will dive into through this work, but also examples that challenge capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy, which are the ideological foundations of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, and the legacy of slavery. So I'm going to now turn it to our panelists to dive into the conversation, and just want to offer that if all of our elected officials can start with introducing themselves and then sharing a sentence or two and really explaining what bill did you sponsor and why did you sponsor it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Crystal Hudson. I'm a council member here in Brooklyn. I represent the neighborhoods of Crown Heights, Prospect Heights, Fort Greene, and Clinton Hill. Really happy to be here with you all this evening. The bill I introduced is Intro 242A, which essentially mandates that CORE and Linda create a process around truth healing and reconciliation. And it was derived from my Black Agenda for New York City that I published back in 2021 when I was first running for office for City Council. I believe, and I don't know this as a matter of fact, but I believe that I'm the only elected official, or at least candidate, to have written or published a Black agenda for New York City, certainly in the city, but probably in the state, I don't know. So that's something that I'm really proud of. I just thought I would throw that out there.
My name is Jamani Williams, public advocate of the city of New York. I don't remember my bill number. I know we had to do that. I was trying to find it. But my bill actually corrected. It is a law now. And, first of all, shout out to my colleagues who put those bills forward, and to the chair who helped usher them through. It's really important. I was glad that mine was part of the package. It was actually a cleanup bill of a bill that we had, of something we had done when I was a council member, that we finally got the administration to do, which was put a marker saying that the first open air slave market happened on Wall Street. And we were going to pass legislation previously. They finally got the administration to do it. And it was in the wrong location. And so we wanted it in the right location, which is across the street. So now it's in the right location. And we thought it was important because, like was said, and thank you to everyone who sponsored the Center for Brooklyn History, Brooklyn Public Library, all the other folks. A lot of people, when they think of the history of slavery, they think about down south, and they don't understand the impact that it has in the northern region, including New York City, and how enslaved Africans helped build City Hall. And most importantly, the first commodity that was traded on Wall Street was human beings. And people don't really understand that what was going on in Wall Street and how it's been pervasive, and which communities still feel the impact and which communities don't, is really traced back through that. So I always feel it's an important conversation to have. And I always also want to make sure I have an understanding that I don't think anyone that I know of owned any slaves, which I don't think anybody in the audience has. And so I don't think that anyone created the systems we're in, but I think everyone is responsible for changing those systems for the next generation. And so I always try to put it there as much as possible and really talk about what anti-Blackness has meant from the inception of this country. And sometimes we have to talk about Black and mean Black. I know sometimes we always bring a lot of folks in it, which we should when it's important. I mean we should because it's important, but when we need to, we really got to focus on what happened to certain communities and try to fix it. And part of that is giving people information and knowledge.
Good evening. I am Natasha Williams. I represent an area in Southeast Queens. Really happy to be in Brooklyn. Don't tell anybody. I like Brooklyn. I worked in Brooklyn for a very long time, so I always tell people I have a permanent passport. I'm always good in Brooklyn. Politically, I only work for Brooklyn elected officials, so I feel at home when I'm here. So I'm chair of the Civil and Human Rights Committee, and I was really excited to put forth a package. We titled it the Juneteenth package last year. And what we did, which was something we don't often do in the council, I don't know how they allowed me to do this, but I looked at a series of bills that some were still in draft, that were sort of like-minded around advancing some form of something, primarily for Black folks in New York City, because I thought it was important. And as a council that is majority people of color, majority of women, I thought it was critically important for us to put something forward. And, fast forward, we were able to pass a few bills we were able to pass. So I carried a bill that would establish a freedom trail, one in Lower Manhattan and one citywide. We heard the other two bills, you hear another bill, and then there were two anti-racism bills that we passed that will train city employees, because prior to our legislation, city employees don't really get regular trainings for anti-racism. And when you think about different agencies and how they have wreaked a lot of terror in our communities, it's really important that these trainings are mandated regularly for city employees. And then we also passed another anti-racism bill for contractors because Even though there are a lot of people within government that deliver a lot of work, as a city, we also contract a lot of our work out to nonprofit organizations and et cetera. And so this bill also requires anti-racism training for them. And again, for me, it was just really important for us to start a conversation. I'm happy that we actually were able to get things passed, but I really wanted us as a council body to put something forward considering the current social and political climate that we've been in.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Councilmember Farrah Lewis, representing Council District 45 in Brooklyn, encompassing the neighborhoods of Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood Flatlands, and parts of Canarsie and Marine Park. I'm gonna read my bill real quick because sometimes folks get it confused. My bill is the sister bill to Crystal's bill, amazing bill, by the way. My bill is Intro 279, now Local Law 92. It is the study on impacts of slavery and its legacies in New York City and recommendations for potential reparative measures for resulting harms. And this bill, the action that has to take place with it is Linda's unit, CORE, as well as the Office of Racial Equity will come up with a list of recommendations that state what those harms were they will state the harms, and then they will basically give that information over. There's a whole big process to it that I guess we'll discuss. I didn't want to go too much into it right now and take away from what you wanted to discuss. But I just wanted to publicly thank Chair Williams for organizing this package and getting it to the finish line and actually starting this process. If it was your efforts that really got us to this place. So I just wanted to publicly thank her, as well as my colleagues, all of us working together to make sure that this is now a reality for our city, and we'll move forward with this process. Thanks.
Can I say one thing before we move on?
You're so long-winded.
No, I'm not. Not from elected. Have you heard? But listen, because it feels really heavy in here. I just wanted to say that. Like, it feels very, very heavy. And I know we had some traumatic stuff just happen yesterday. Folks are going through it. So I just want to take a second to ask everybody to breathe. Just. It's okay. We're still here. Our ancestors did what they had to do, and they got us here. We have to do what we have to do for the next generation. So I know it's a little heavy space, but I just wanted to name that, and we can have a good conversation about what we're trying to do.
That was worth it.
That's truly in the practice of racial healing. It's our deep breaths. Okay, so we're going to start to get into reparations and want to acknowledge one thing that's particularly important about this reparations bill in New York City that we've received positive comments on from across the nation. We've been talking to other jurisdictions, is that we are the only jurisdiction, we are the only reparation study that we know of so far that is looking inward. And that this bill says, well, what did New York City government do? What was government's role? And that's very, very critical, one, for understanding why it aligns with CORE, but two, because the foresight to really think about, well, if government's going to make some structural change, we have to be held accountable for our role in this work. So across the nation, reparations task forces and commissions are launching with a charge to advance repair, which could include changes in land use, absolutely a check, reparations money, but also thinking about broader structural change. So beyond land, thinking through what does our financing system look like? What does a segregation in schools look like? Redlining, our housing. So from your perspective, understanding that New York City is a multiracial democracy, that's what we are continuously aspiring to be. What role does solidarity play in how you understand, support, or practice repair to the communities that were directly impacted by chattel slavery?
I would say, I always use the example of, I guess I would call it feedback, that I received when I published my Black Agenda, which was from non-Black people who said, well, what about us? And my response was always, if you actually center the needs of the communities that have been most harmed and most marginalized, then everybody benefits. So it was an agenda that was meant to be inclusive and not exclusive. And I think, that's my answer to your question, which is solidarity looks like just because you may not be a Black person, just because you may not have a direct story or connection, just because you maybe aren't a generational resident of New York City, doesn't mean that you can't stand in solidarity and understand the importance of these pieces of legislation and the work that will come out of them. And I think, when Black people are doing well, when disabled people are doing well, when older adults are doing well, when immigrants are doing well, then everybody is doing well. And so that's the perspective that I come to this with.
I think solidarity is extremely important. Unifying conversations are really important. For me, I always say that I think everybody kind of wants the same thing. Like everybody wants to eat some good food. They want to have a safe place to live, and they'd like their children to do better than they did. Communities have different barriers to that, and I feel as my job is to try to figure out what's the barriers in those communities. We should all, I think, be unified in fixing what those barriers are. We also have to be honest about what those barriers are. So, and we have to receive the way people feel, whether, I try to do it at least at the beginning without as much judgment as possible. And so the feedback that comes back, I didn't own any slaves, I didn't part of Jim Crow or anything like that. But what we have to figure out is, okay, what happened? What is the impact? And do we need to correct it? And so to believe that it's coincidence that there are more people in our jails from the community that was enslaved than people who did the enslaving from those communities, that it's just a pure coincidence. That doesn't make any sense. So we should dig into that and find out. And looking at most data sets, the communities that were enslaved, percentage-wise, are doing worse than the communities who weren't. Also not a coincidence. So we got to figure out what's going there, and we should all want to figure out why. And also, sometimes people use individual experiences to counter communal impact. So of course there are actually a lot of poor white Americans, poor white New York City residents, and there are rich Black folks. That doesn't take away from what the impact of the community has been feeling for such a long time, and sometimes we try to interject and conflate those two things. And the fact of the matter is, depending where you live, you have to work either really, really, really hard just to break even and succeed, or you have to work really, really, really hard just to fail because your community is so set up differently. And we should figure out why that is, and we should all want to do that because we all benefit. It just so happens for the communities that were formerly enslaved, there's a particular thing that happened, and we got to figure out how to fix that.
I'll be brief. I think solidarity is a collective moral obligation. And so I truly believe in the human race. And it gets complicated when you have conversations about the human race, but this is a collective moral obligation. Folks who have been disproportionately harmed by slavery and its aftermath didn't get there alone. And so everyone has to play a role in addressing the harm. So that's my form of solidarity, is collective moral obligation. Like, we all have a moral obligation to do something to repair harm.
I'll just add to what Dr. Williams just shared. I remember Chair Williams organized a call for us to meet with the folks in California that created their reparations task force to share with us the pros and the cons of the process. I don't know if you remember that. For me, it was an opportunity for us to build solidarity, but it was collective advocacy to see what could we do better for all of us during this process. From California, it was Detroit, then it was Philadelphia, then it was Boston, and all these conversations were happening. And it was a space for us to build solidarity as a nation, to have this conversation, and for us to build the momentum to get to where we need to be, to dismantle all the things that have been happening for generations. So collective advocacy, I think, is really important.
So you all have raised building a united front for this work, but also building a united front as a moral calling, a moral obligation. And that's certainly how many folks are feeling across the nation and certainly across the city as we move into this new administration. And we are already starting to see some of the executive orders that are coming down, a lot of the language that is being brought up again after we've had a break for about 4 years. We're coming back to it. As folks continue to build united fronts in New York City, I think it'd be helpful to hear from all of you why advance reparations now? And why advance reparations to focus specifically, to have a study that's focused so specifically on government?
I wish I had a good answer for this, and I think, I'm gonna be real with y'all, because I think as elected officials, like, people are expecting us to, like, be really optimistic and, like, say these, like, nice, flowery things. I don't know at this point, because, I mean, yes, I wanted it to be a part of the conversation. There's been a trend of this. We know it needs to happen. Before we all got into office, there were people who fought very hard to even make this a topic of conversation in any real space. And so to me, I feel like we are just picking up the mantle of the work that was started long before us. And as a person that believes in justice, as a person that believes in equity, I feel like, again, I have a moral obligation to pick up that mantle and continue the fight despite what our environment looks like. And I know I've been seeing so much of this stuff from companies with the DEI stuff, from even some of our colleagues who are in the same party, the way they're changing their language around certain things because of the political climate. When things were really, really bad, and not that things aren't bad now, but when things were really, really bad, people still believed. And as a person who does have an imagination, we cannot allow the current state of affairs to impact the decisions and the actions that we do now. So I hope that was, like, trying to answer the question, but it's very difficult. And to your point, I did read some of those executive orders that have come out in, like, a matter of 24 hours. And it is frightening. It is demoralizing for the work that we're trying to do. But again, I know that there are folks whose, shoulders and, like, labor that we are benefiting from right now. And I feel like, again, as a person who truly believes in justice, I have an obligation to continue the fight despite what might be happening.
I say, let's give her a round of applause for that. If not now, then when? Right? We see a lot of our forefathers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and so many others who took the opportunity to take a stand at that time. I don't think, and this is just my opinion, we'll see this again. So many Black elected officials willing to put themselves out there for reparative process to make sure that this happens. So the time is now. You strike while the iron is hot. We know who's in office in the federal government. And while they don't want to see these actions take place, it is our responsibility to stand on the forefront and do it now. And you have a generation of young people that are expecting us to do this for them. So now they have a mantle to carry and take up with them to move forward. But if we don't do it now, it's not going to happen.
So, to that end, first, I just want to shout out the council. As I mentioned, this is 200 years after it was made illegal in New York City. And it shows the importance of representation, because it took a council that was a majority people of color and majority women. So shout out to Black women in particular that are always pushing this forward. that we're able to get this done. To the question, I'm gonna keep it a buck. Democrats didn't do it either. And if they had done it, we wouldn't be here trying to push it. And so, as was mentioned, like it's not like the other folks really did what they were supposed to. And I think if they had, we might not be where we are. But that's a different panel for a different conversation. I am thankful that right before this, people were starting to get it. But this is tremendous pressure to have this. And I want to be clear, people get uncomfortable when black folks talk about black folks. It's the only group that makes people, if we were up here talking about how do we, women against misogyny, if we were talk about even our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, if we talking about our Asian brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, it doesn't make people as uncomfortable as when black folks, okay, what can we do with black folks? It just, everybody's supposed to go crazy, and the conversation is unnecessarily difficult. And I will say anti-blackness exists in all of those groups that we just spoke about. So it's where you talk about, if you want to keep it funky, anti-blackness,
including about in black
ourselves,
communities.
yes, it's also in ourselves. So it's a real big thing, and it's by design, I think, and it has been by design, and so we have to push through that whenever the opportunity presents itself and whoever is in charge.
So absolutely agree, this is by design. And recognizing that chattel slavery, that Jim Crow, both have very strong legacies that we experience day to day. Our Black mothers are still losing their children and asking workers not to send their kids up the river. That comes from the intention of breaking down the Black family during chattel slavery, of separating Black families, and then for 400 years later to turn it on us, right? There is a legacy for every bias, discrimination, and stereotype, and anti-Blackness exists in all of those. And so diving in a little bit more, wanting to talk about your perspective from your position, how does the legacy of slavery show up in New York City government, in our services, our programs and investments? Feel free to talk about any other pieces of work that you have either passed as a bill or other programs that you have supported.
I feel like we could probably go on forever on this particular question. For me, I mean, the first thing I think about is our school system, which is the largest and most segregated school system in the country. If you think about housing, when our public housing system was created, NYCHA, it was, people were prideful. It was the place that people wanted to live. It was if you had a good job with a good, and you made a good living with good wages, then you lived in public housing and you had a community and it was clean. And then Black people started moving in, and then it is what it is today, which is, we do not upkeep our public housing system, and we're in such deep disrepair that it almost can't be fixed as it is. And so I have constituents, who, when the elevator breaks down, older people who literally are sitting in the lobby for hours until friendly neighbors or the fire department can come and carry them up to their apartment. And that's just one example. I won't even get into heat and the boilers and all of that. But it's infrastructure, right? It is all by design, because when it wasn't Black people living in public housing was clean and wonderful and kept well and all of that. And every system, I think about, we fight constantly. I'll speak for myself and maybe Jamani, but we fight constantly with the mayor's administration on, everything really, but but really policing. Jamani and I carried bills along with a colleague, Councilmember Alexa Viles, for accountability and transparency in policing. And it's just Yeah, it was such a fight to do something so basic, like reporting. Anyway, like I said, I can go on and on. I won't go on and on, but it's everywhere. It's policing, and it's government. It's government agencies. It's government policies, practices, laws that we have on the books that are literally that exist to keep Black people down and Black communities down. Even thinking about our budget. Our budget is a moral document. You know, we have disinvested in Black communities. And then to the public advocate's point, when we say out loud we should be investing in Black communities and in Black people and in Black schools, then it's like, oh, well, we can't talk about that. Or what about everybody else? Or what about this? Anyway, I'll end it there.
No, for me, by design, I always say, if the quote unquote forefathers of the country woke up, they probably wonder why you had a Black president or why women are voting, but otherwise you did a good job of doing what we put forth. And so the design is actually working how it was designed, which I think makes it more difficult because this is how it's supposed to operate. Also for me was helpful in actually thinking about how to talk about this during doing the work around the Me Too movement, working more with LGBTQ brothers and sisters, was figuring out, and it was very helpful to be on another side, that I don't have to be a misogynist to have benefited from and moved forward a misogynist system. I don't have to be homophobic or transphobic to have moved forward those systems. And so someone doesn't necessarily have to be a racist to have benefited from or help move forward a system that is racist. Now you might be, right? You never want to take it off the table. But that just not, so sometimes when we have these conversations, people's defensive is, I'm not racist, I'm not. And you might not be, that doesn't mean you didn't benefit from or help move forward. And so the things that we have either benefit from or help move forward, we got to figure out how to change that. And in terms of the systems, man, it's baked in all of those. The one where we usually get the most energetic is around policing, if there's a fatal shooting. And sometimes, obviously when this happens, not everybody is said is racist. But even if that's not how you define yourself, and there are split-second decisions that have to be made, in that split second, why did you feel this person who looks a certain way was dangerous and this person wasn't? And that's things that we have to unpack because it has real-life consequences. And what frustrates me is those other systems are killing the community just as much. Sometimes it happens a little slower. We should have the same amount of energy about what's happening in education, what's happening in housing, what's happening in food insecurity. As more Black electors have risen in the past 20 years, which is awesome, 200 Black folks had to leave the city because they couldn't afford to live here. That's something we need to talk about as well. And the disinvestment is very real, and what some deceitful elected officials will do is now try to blame migrants who were here for that disinvestment, even though it happened long before the migrants were here, and we had the money to spend it and made a decision that these communities were not as in crisis as they were.
I whispered
Did I lose people to migrants? Is it? My bad.
I whispered to the public advocate, so I'm just going to share. I just saw a calendar. So February 26th, I've been asking for a hearing about exactly what Councilmember Hudson said, which is the segregation of schools in New York City, right? We're a very diverse city, but we are very segregated, and so I'm excited. So we're gonna have a joint hearing, February 26th, 70 years since Brown versus Board of Education, and our school system is like more segregated than it's ever been. I also just wanted to note that I did equity roundtables that Councilmember Lewis had participated in and Linda participated in 3 areas, which racism and slavery and its aftermaths are so pervasive and embedded in every single system that we operate in. It's almost invisible. And it doesn't matter what you look like, who you are, we all uphold, even me. I have to sometimes check my own privilege as an elected official, a decision maker. We all kind of contribute to upholding white supremacy, because it's just that pervasive. But 3 areas where you can like visually see the disparity is criminal justice, mental health, and education. Like you can physically see it. Like we talk a lot about it, and sometimes it's hard to put your finger on it, but when you physically can see the disparity, those areas I feel are very important and should be prioritized and speak to the many issues we have in New York City.
Thank you for that. Public advocate, I thought you was gonna add housing a little bit more, right? Because as you were speaking, I was thinking about when you were a council member, the efforts you had to put behind mandatory inclusionary housing, and how hard of a fight that was for you and your colleagues at that time. But if we're talking about by design, we were working, my staffer Daniel's here somewhere, we were working on the redistricting process. And as we received information back from the land use division, they told us, oh, you have the least amount of parks out of all the council members. You have the least amount of senior centers out of all the council members. You have the least amount of schools out of all the council members, all of it by design. And as we're having this conversation, I'm just thinking about the disparities this particular district had to encounter for so long and what we have to fight, which is the purpose of this whole panel and the conversations behind reparations. I also think about these 2 bills in the city council that we've been trying to hear since I got into the council on missing persons and human trafficking. The block, mayor's office. Why? They don't want to have conversations about Black missing kids. They don't want to have conversations about Black missing women. Why? Till this day, we're still trying to fight this. It takes legislation for us to move things forward, as my colleagues just stated, whether it's public safety, whether it's housing or anything else. But the support we need is from folks like yourself to make sure that these bills move forward, because it supports communities like yours in order for us to get it to move forward.
Can I just add one thing? Because I want to just something that I feel like can touch every single person in the audience. Because if you didn't go to a New York City public school, if you don't live in public housing, if you don't interact with government in any other sort of way, one thing to think about this is also trash and sanitation. If you walk through your neighborhood, if you walk through this neighborhood, or you walk through Park Slope and you look at the alternate side parking signs, the requirement to move your car is like 1 day a week. On Monday, you can't park here for 30 minutes because we're assuming that your streets are very clean. But if you go into Crown Heights in my district, if you go into Southeast Queens in Councilmember Natasha Williams' district, if you go into predominantly black and brown communities across New York City, then you see 4 times a week we have to clean your neighborhoods because we're assuming, and they do have a metric that they use, which I think is faulty. So I'm saying assuming, but they don't assume. They do actually use a metric, so let me not misspeak. But I think the faulty metric that they use presumes that communities of color and black communities are much dirtier than whiter communities. So the next time you're walking in any particular neighborhood, take a look at the alternate side parking signs and look to see how frequently they're cleaning the trash in one neighborhood versus another.
Thank you. So far what we've heard today was a lot of truth-telling. And that's a very critical component of the work that we're doing, both the reparations study, but also the truth, healing, and reconciliation bills. This work will require everyone to come out and tell their truth. How has chattel slavery or Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery impacted your life, your family's life, being forced to leave New York City for safety, coming back to New York City out of need for a job or for any other reason? So I do want to move to the healing part of this work. So truth, healing, and reconciliation really serves as a companion to the reparations study. Why was naming this bill, Truth, Healing, Reconciliation, important? Why was naming making amends important to this work? And what are we all hoping will be the outcome of these conversations?
Yeah, I mean, we need truth, healing, and reconciliation. That's why, for me, also when I was writing the Black Agenda, it wasn't solely about reparations. It wasn't solely about, and the way I was thinking about it too was like, you know, providing some sort of reparations for the pain and suffering that people have experienced without acknowledging what you've done, to me, is sort of meaningless. And so I wanted to make sure that there was a process that we created where government, because as we've all talked about, we have, you know, policies, laws, practices that are still, you know, alive and well every single day here in New York, that we're not like looking at and addressing directly. And I think it's really important to do that work. And really, until you're getting at the root cause, you could talk about the symptoms of this and that and the other, but until you're really digging deep and getting at the root cause and saying, this is what this government has done to you, this is how we've done it, this is what it looks like, and this is how we're going to undo it, then you can't really get to reparations, right? Because through that process, you have to determine what people are owed or what communities are owed. And then I also think about conversations with folks who talk about, you know, the Germany having, you know, acknowledged and owned its history in the Holocaust. And then here in America, we can't even say, you know, it's like the public advocate was saying, you have every turn when you talk about the issue, people say, well, I didn't own slaves. I didn't do that. Well, we're not talking about you as an individual. We're talking about the history of this nation. And if we can't acknowledge it as a nation, that we did this terrible thing, and in every city and state, how it has directly and negatively impact Black people. I mean, we don't even talk about Indigenous people, right? We're up here talking about Black people because that is our lived history and truth. But find 4 Indigenous, Native elected officials in any government body, anywhere in this country, right? Like you can't find it. And the way we have erased the Indigenous population, you know, like he said, that's another topic, another panel for another day. But like, you know, what we're trying to do here is, at least in New York City, say like, we know and we acknowledge that we have caused this harm as a government and as an entity. And here are the ways in which we think we can at least start to address it, or even talk about addressing it. And hopefully this can be a model for the rest of the nation. Hopefully.
You know, I think without the truth of things that happened, we respond differently. And so, I would sometimes ask folks, because there is a lot of violence in communities that look like ours. So I ask folks, do you think that Black folks are born uneducable and, you know, hereditary, with DNA, more prone to crime? If the answer is yes, then we have to have some different questions. But if the answer is no, something's really, really wrong that we're not doing anything to fix this. And we need to talk about how we got there, not as an excuse, because I don't want to excuse their behavior, but what happened to these communities, why these things are going on. And are we simply going to try to arrest the children of the people we arrested 20 years ago and hope that that is a different response when we know that it won't be? What happened with redlining? What happened to Rob Moses? What happened? The housing crisis, Black folks came in with the least wealth and lost the most. That happens repeatedly. And then, you know, folks will say, you know, slavery ended how many years ago? And I have to remind them, yes, but imagine if you're an enslaved African, you're free, and every single institution that you need to live is run by the people who just owned you. So pretending like it just ended and everything was great just doesn't even make any sense. And with the truth discussion, also I'm hoping, you know, also part of it, I think you need to create spaces where people can have uncomfortable conversations, because people have these things and these questions, ideas in their head, and we pretend that they don't, and they go home with it and they have the conversations and they use it to go vote the wrong way, or they make some other decisions while they're working. Whereas if we can have an honest conversation, maybe some of this stuff can bubble up and we can talk about what happened. How do you feel? Why do you feel this way? That's not really what I'm saying. Like, those conversations are important, but pretending that people don't have ideas that we will, you know, look differently on, or some people don't need education around certain spaces, is not truthful, and I think it's harming us as a population, as a community of folks who then take those back home to our family and have it in private conversations when it's really a public impact.
Great, thank you so much. We are going to move to some community questions. These are not in any particular order. So our first question is, can you talk more about food and land justice as it pertains to your view on reparations? And this question can be for any of our panelists.
That's a great question, and I think it's also well, we do talk about like land justice and housing and things like that, community land trusts and the sort, but we don't really talk about food as much as we should, I think. And I think all of those systems are included in this process. And when we think about the foods that are accessible to our communities versus other communities, and then we see the direct correlation with health outcomes. I mean, we saw this also during, the height of the pandemic in 2020, all the comorbidities that Black and Brown communities had, and the rate of death that was so much greater in our communities because of, the foods that we have access to, the limited foods, I would say, that we have access to. But land justice is also part of this process. I know, one of the things that I always think about and try to include is, taking back land and property. We're working on a package of deed theft bills now in the council, but really thinking about even with like predatory landlords and things like that. And this is like really complex stuff in terms like legally to address legislatively. But we have these conversations all the time around how do we allow tenants to take ownership of a building where the landlord has been so intentionally neglectful. You have a building that has, and the Public Advocate's Office puts out the worst landlords list every year. You have buildings where it is all Black people living in a building, and there's no heat, there's no hot water. They do construction as a means to get people out. What if those tenants could then own, what if the government took that property from that negligent and predatory landlord and then gave it to the tenants in the building, and then help the tenants, maintain that building? That to me is, land justice.
Microphone check. All right. I do need to head out, but I quickly wanted to just add to what Councilmember Hudson just shared. One way we're combating food justice in the City Council, Speaker Adrian Adams was able to do an analysis and provide more funding to neighborhoods that are the most impoverished and have the least amount of fresh foods. And she was able to put in additional funding into those specific districts. Now, we're not where we need to be. Obviously, if she had more access to funds, we'll be able to do it in every district. But this is a prevailing issue that we know that we need to address in the City Council and overall in the whole state. But one step forward for us is what our speaker was able to put forth in this new fiscal budget, and we look forward to doing more of that. And just to add to an additional point that you made, Crystal, community land trust is something that's big for us in the council, and I know Councilmember Hudson is leading this with some of our colleagues, making sure that access to particular land is available for those that need it the most. I don't know if you want to highlight that a little bit more, but I know that that's something that you've been intimately involved in with some of our colleagues. And I want to thank you all I want to thank the center, Linda, and everyone for inviting us this evening. I hope you all have a blessed remainder of your week. Thanks.
Okay, so I think we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. Our next question is on social media. So what is your opinion on how to face and thwart what seems to be a coordinated and strategic blackout of these issues? During 2020, people were galvanized through the power of social media, but now social media and Google are limiting social justice terms. Hashtag Democrats on Instagram and the banning of influencers on TikTok were two examples.
I don't know the full answer to that. I will say, social media is important. It's not the only thing that we have. A lot of this work was done without any social media at all, and we need to continue to use it as a tool. I will say, we don't have time to talk about. I wanted to talk about ADOS and FBA, which is also on social media. It's American Descendants of Slaves and Foundation of Black Americans, who I think have some really important things, and actually, frankly, should be probably leading in these spaces. But there's some spaces where I think they make it more difficult to have the conversation. So I think there's a lot to talk about social media, and not just that, but I think those of us here actually use social media to advance these things, and we should just use whatever tool we have. It's going to be a rough 4 years. So we have a 4-year plan. Hopefully we have a 2-year plan. I hope people are not thinking 4 years. And we just have to use whatever it is that exists. We know that they're going to try to push back. We know we're going to do those things, so we have to fight it, but we have to do it while we're pushing forward. To the previous question, I think there's a lot of folks who are trying to pre-assume what the answer is going to be. And so I've been trying to let the process play. You got people trying to divvy up money that's not even there. So I think the reason for these discussions and for the bills is to make space for people to have the very questions that people are pushing to get answers to. What did the government do? In our case, how did they do it? Where can they rectify it? I think there's a lot of spaces, including land, including food. How do we actually get to it? Is a different question. I think that's one. We have to get people to agree that we should do that. So we don't even have everybody there yet before we get to jumping, well, what's the check number going to be?
I was just going to say, I also don't have an answer, and, just keeping it real, I think it's going to be extremely difficult to hold anyone accountable on social media, or to talk about any of this stuff on social media when you have the likes of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and every other white male billionaire tech, entrepreneur supporting this presidency. That's the done on that. Yeah. Making our own, absolutely. Maybe we have some tech entrepreneurs in the room.
For us, by
I'm
us.
not one.
That's what I was thinking about. I don't think it's going to be an easy task. I actually had 2 conversations today about the fact that I feel like we're not doing enough. And if there are people doing more, where are they? So I can, co-collaborate with them. And when I say we're not doing enough, I just don't know where the think tanks are, the activists are, the decision makers are, sitting around with, flip chart around a table trying to hash out some of this stuff long term. We cannot think about short-term strategies, but long-term. And the thing I've been thinking about is, how do we build stamina for sustainability? Because this is going to be a long-haul fight. But when I think about social media and how we can get the message out, we really need to, again, I thought about FUBU, which is literally for us, by us, and figuring out how to create. And there's spaces out there. I know people on Fanbase. It's a Black man that owns that. So there are these sort of other social media spaces that we can try to migrate to. Is very difficult because people are losing their minds off of TikTok being gone for 8 hours. So I don't know how to move people off these platforms. I think about just the economy. There are a lot of people making a lot of money on social media, especially these big platforms. So you also are talking about where people are feeding their families. I think there's just so many different things that we have to consider, but we have to be able to have stamina and sit around on the table and figure it out. And I know I don't have the answers, but what I'm really, really passionate about, and even with the public advocate, we've even had conversations about what does this space look like? Like, what do we need to be doing? Who needs to be at the table so we can figure it out? Because it's clear. Like, if we knew the answers, like, we wouldn't be here. Like, we would not be having this panel right now if we knew the answers. And so, to me, this moment in time calls for us to, like, really, like, put our brains together, like, go in the lab. You know, I feel like we really need to spend some time in the lab running some experiments, figuring out how to solve for a lot of the issues that we discussed just now. And I'm sure the tons of questions that people have, I'm like, yo, if you have those questions, like, me too. And how can we work together to find the answers is kind of where I'm at. And I'm also Cinderella. If you know about the Long Island Railroad, I have to catch my train. So I'm so sorry. I've really enjoyed this conversation and being with my colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We're going to close.
I want to say that, and I have to dip as well. I apologize.
Don't worry, I'm staying.
Okay.
Crystal and I are going to close this out.
No, and I think I did lose some folks on the migrant thing, so I wanted to come back to that because it's important. I also know we want to elect the right folks, and Crystal was reminding me what I always say, which is we sometimes confuse. We have more black representation on every level than we've ever had, and we're still having the same problems, which means I think sometimes we confuse black persons doing better with black people doing better, and those are two different things. And we have to make sure we have folks that are actually going to change the systems, not try to mimic it and say it was there before and try to copy it. That's not the reason for us being there. With the migrant, I know that it is easy to get angry about, and I always talk about myself because sometimes I get angry and I have to back up and make sure I'm angry at the right people. And so you have folks saying, look at all these billions of dollars that I had to take from you and spend on the migrants. And that really touches particularly black and brown folks who've been there for a long time and we haven't gotten what we've gotten. And sometimes it looks like, this is for another conversation, other groups come and use the blueprint and the trauma and then catapult past. This is another conversation. But then that is not true. And so when people tell you that, you should ask them, well, why didn't you spend it on us? Because the money has always been here. And so I know for a fact that they would not have spent it on you because they didn't spend it on you. And they didn't view what you were going through as a crisis. That is a decision that leaders made, not to spend the money we always had, because we always had the money to house people, clothe people, and feed people, and give them mental health services. Always, always, always. They chose not to. And now they want you not to aim at them and aim at a group of people who had nothing to do with it. And that just makes it harder to do what it is we actually have to do. And you can see the budgets are coming out now for next year. People are talking about surpluses. For all the things they talked about, there's now surpluses. So don't let them have people who have little fight people who have none when they actually have enough for everybody. Please, I beg you, it's difficult. Just aim your anger properly. Thank you.
I just want to add,
Oh, my worst landlord list is coming out tomorrow. Is that right? Worst landlord list is coming out tomorrow.
Oh, good.
Okay, peace.
I look forward to perusing the list. I was just going to say, I tell people all the time, when government tells you there's no money, there's always money. Government just does that. We always tell people there's no money for anything.
Yeah. So I just want to reflect for a second. We've done a lot of truth telling. We've practiced some healing. And we have a lot of work to do. We had a call to action at the end, right? Every single council member and elected official shared with you. We have a budget that just came out that is about what resources you may or may not get. This is your time to reach out to your council members and share what you want to see. They have the power to push back, approve, or disapprove of the budget. And you all elected them, and so you have the right to reach out to them about that budget. But that's not the only piece. You have a New York City that is working on reparations, truth healing, and reconciliation, and you have a New York State Commission that is working on reparations. And combined, because we know that the city and the state need to be coordinated. And our elected officials knew that and wrote that into the legislation. So combined together, we will advance reparations and racial equity in New York City. You are talking and working with a group of people who are committed to not retreating in this moment. That is not an option for any of our elected officials. That is not an option for the communities that have come to the conversation. Our ancestors did not retreat, which is why we are here, and so we cannot take that stance either. So if you want to get involved, please reach out to CORE, follow us on social media at Racial Equity NYC. I guess considering today's conversation, for as long as that hashtag and or handle will exist. But please email us, reach out to us, join the work. We are just getting started. I have all of your questions. We're going to work them into our constant community updates. And please reach out to your elected officials. The fight started 400 years ago, but will continue until we reach our freedom. Thank you.
Thank you.